Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal with another lecture for your Research Methods 2 class. In today's class, we're going to talk about an overview of the structure of a full paper, just briefly. Then we will review writing an outline, which we went over in our last video. And we will talk about moving from your outline to having a first draft of your introduction section. This is called the hourglass model, and this is the typical structure for a full-length APA-style paper. As a reminder, your paper number 1 is just your introduction, but your paper number 2 will be the full APA-style paper, including all of the sections that you see on this slide. The idea behind the hourglass model is that you start kind of broad with your introduction. You are providing an overview of your topic and information about your topic that is a little bit more general. Toward the end of your introduction section, things get a little bit more specific, right? Because you're talking about your specific theory, and that leads into your specific hypotheses. Then you discuss your methods for your study, and that is also extremely narrow and specific. Same with your results. You start your discussion very narrow and specific, and then you get broader again to talk about it in the context of the broader topic overall. Here's a review of writing an outline that we went over last time. So if you haven't watched the video from last module, please go ahead and do so. This will just be a quick review of that. So you start your introduction section with your opening paragraphs. This includes a general statement about your research question, a statement of why this particular research question is important with a rationale. So why should people care about this topic? It provides an explanation of why you are proposing your specific hypotheses in the way that you are. So how you're making the case for your hypotheses. And provides a brief overview and definitions of key constructs if it's not obvious. It ends with a general overall statement of your study hypotheses in sentence form. After you finish your opening paragraphs, when you're writing your introduction, then you move on to provide paragraphs about each of your study variables in turn. Remember that you have 3 study variables for paper number 1 in this class. So the first one that you're focusing on is your variable number 1, and you're going to thoroughly define that variable, citing research papers, and you're going to put the results of your literature review here. This would include prior research findings on this variable. For instance, what predicts this variable? What leads people to experience this behavior or this thought process or this disorder? What are some other outcomes of this particular variable? So those are some things that you can focus on in your literature review. You want to, again, include citations to research studies and theory. And you do the same thing for your variable number 2 and the same thing for your variable number 3. One question that I sometimes get asked is, what order do I put my variables in? Which is number 1, which is number 2, and which is number 3? And that really depends on your paper, your specific topic and your paper, and what makes the most sense. Sometimes, like say you have one outcome variable, maybe you want to go ahead and define that first, and then talk about your predictor variables. But it could go the other way as well, depending on your specific topic. Following your explanation of your 3 variables, you then have a paragraph to tie together what you are, and leads up to what you are proposing in your hypotheses. So you provide a rationale for why you are proposing the hypotheses that you are, so how those variables relate to one another. And you include theory. You want to detail why, according to those theories, you expect what you do in your hypotheses, and make sure that you have a logical argument where you can make the case for your hypotheses. So you want to state in your own words, for instance, why you expect A to positively relate to B, or group 1 to have higher or lower levels than group 2, whatever your hypotheses are. And then at the end of your introduction section, you state those hypotheses. So then what? After you have completed your outline, then you want to turn your outline into your introduction. And if you spent a lot of time on your outline and you've done a good job with it, then turning your outline into your introduction should be easier than the process of creating the outline itself. So first, you want to change your bulleted points into whole sentences. You want to flesh out the statements you provided in your outline. So you want to go back to your outline and look at what you wrote, and you will have cited readings in your outline that you found during your literature review. So go to your notes on those readings and provide more detail as you turn your outline into your introduction. You want to add guiding words in transition sentences to help the reader along, so to make sure that the paper flows well. So words like additionally and furthermore and therefore, this leads us to believe that blah, blah, blah. You want to make sure that each paragraph flows into the next paragraph. You want to make sure that each sentence flows into the next sentence, and everything kind of flows along logically. Okay, so I am providing here a sample outline that could be turned into paragraphs for your introduction section. Okay, so I'm pretending that this is my variable number 1, and this could be a piece of my outline where I am working on defining my variable 1, citing research papers, I'm describing the results of my literature review in terms of prior findings and citations. Okay, so the construct that I'm focusing on for variable number 1 is called civility norms. So civility norms are essentially how much workers treat each other with respect and avoid rude behavior. So you can see that bullet is the first bullet under definition and background. And I cited a researcher there who had published a study that provided that definition. Now, civility is how workers treat each other with respect and are not rude to each other. But the other key part of that definition is norms, right? And so I then explained in the second bullet what norms are. So I said norms convey what is acceptable behavior in a group, and I cite Hackman 1992 for that. So I've got 2 bullet points there for my definition and background. And so the next part of it is to talk about the results of my literature review and prior research findings. So you can see the first major bullet under prior findings is that civility norms are associated with lower levels of workplace incivility. So remember that I mentioned earlier that you could talk about maybe outcomes of one of your variables, and that could be part of your prior findings. So that's an outcome. If you have high levels of civility norms, you will tend to have lower levels of actual incivility happening in the workplace. Then I went on to define what workplace incivility is because I hadn't previously defined it. I defined civility norms up above, so I added a sub-bullet with a definition for workplace incivility as being when workers treat each other with disrespect and rudeness, citing Anderson and Pearson in 1999. And then I also added another sub-bullet about the extent of incivility. So incivility is widespread, and some of the outcomes of incivility. It can cause damage to individuals and organizations, and I have cited 2 research studies for that. Then I provided another major sub-bullet under prior findings that says effective leadership can help promote civility norms. So this is getting at predictors of civility norms. So what do we know that affects civility norms in the workplace? What can lead to better or worse civility norms? So in my literature review, I found 2 things. One is ethical leadership, what we call ethical leadership, or leaders setting an example for workers to behave ethically, and also charismatic leadership. And I cite the Walsh et al. 2018 article there. So this is an example of what your outline should sort of look like in terms of the type of detail, in terms of definition and background and prior findings that you should have here. Now, on the next slide, slide 7, we will take a look at how I turned that outline into paragraphs. So the part in red near the top is the definition and background on the variable civility norms. So I turned those bullets into sentences like this. I said, civility norms refer to the extent to which workers treat each other with respect and avoid rude behavior. Walsh et al. 2012. Group norms convey to employees what is and is not acceptable behavior. Behavior that deviates from such norms is often corrected by group members. Heckman, 1992. Therefore, when employees perceive positive civility norms, they see their workplace as one in which civility or respectful treatment is expected and incivility is not tolerated. So that third sentence there basically summarizes and applies what I said in the previous two sentences to explain it to the reader. Now notice that I had 3 sentences there, so that is actually a full paragraph. Oftentimes paragraphs are longer than 3 sentences, but as a minimum, each of your paragraphs should include 3 sentences. The next part in dark blue font is providing the findings of my literature review. The first part I focus on outcomes of the variable, which is civility norms. So I turned those bullets on the previous slide into text by saying, research shows that civility norms are negatively correlated with incivility experiences, which are low-level rude behaviors. Workplace incivility has been found to lead to psychological harm for individual workers, including symptoms of depression and anxiety. Incivility is also financially costly to organizations, which experience greater turnover when incivility levels are high. Therefore, it is important to identify ways to prevent high levels of incivility and to promote positive civility norms. So again, I'm providing the research on outcomes of the variable, which is incivility, and I provide information about some of the harmful effects of incivility and how we need to identify ways to promote high levels of civility and prevent high levels of incivility. In the next paragraph, I took those last few bullet points and turned them into sentences to talk about what predicts civility norms. I said one factor that helps promote positive civility norms at work is ethical leadership. Ethical leaders set examples for workers for good behavior, which can promote respectful behavior between workers. Another factor that promotes positive civility norms at work is charismatic leadership. Leaders who motivate their workers and engage with them emotionally help set positive norms for civility in organizations. So hopefully by looking at this sample of a part of an outline and how I turned that into some paragraphs, you can get a sense for what you would do in your own paper number 1. If you have any questions about that, of course, just let me know. Let's talk a little bit now about composing paragraphs. And as a reminder, this is also in your Done book, pages 64 through 65. A paragraph generally contains the following: a sentence containing a main point, a sentence containing defining general words, if any, found in that main point, and 1 or more examples illustrating the main point with any applicable citations. This is where published studies may be summarized and incorporated into your paper. And finally, a summary sentence that helps transition to the next paragraph. To summarize past research in a paragraph, think about beginning with a summary statement and then support that statement with citations of specific research articles or theories. Here's an example. Racial minorities experience negativity as a result of not only their minority status, but also due to the degree to which they physically fit into their racial category. For instance, Hebel et al. 2012 found that Blacks who have more stereotypical features are often excluded from online and offline social networks. So in the first sentence, you're summarizing it in your own words and stating a general sentence about the literature. And then you're adding the results of a specific study to back up that point that you're making. Let's now talk about some common mistakes that I've seen students make in writing their papers for this class. First, on the left, is that it can be difficult sometimes to understand the purpose of what the students are trying to say. So the central purpose or argument that you're making should be readily apparent to the reader. So I shouldn't be confused about what you're trying to argue or what you're trying to propose in your research study. Make sure that it's clear and that you don't digress, which means that you don't go off the tracks too much to talk about things that are unrelated to the variables in your study. Next, sometimes the paper doesn't flow well, and that can come from a lack of organization. It can be difficult sometimes to identify the reasoning that the student is using in terms of the logic to lead up to their proposed hypotheses. And each section sometimes can seem to be independent or not connected to the other sections. So the purpose of the outline is to help you and provide a structure for you to make sure that your paper flows well. If you follow that outline structure, then you should be okay. Next is not referencing enough. So make sure that if it's not your own thought, if you got that thought from a research article, that you are referencing that research article. If it is your own thought, then it should be clear to me or to the reader that it is your own thought. So I shouldn't be wondering whether or not you thought that or you took it from a paper. APA style problems, like not including citations in the text or doing it in a way that's not consistent with APA style. We are going to spend another module going over APA style in more detail. And language use. So try not to talk to the audience as if you would talk to a friend. Use a more formal tone, but having said that, you don't want to use overly complicated language. So you want to be clear, concise, and direct. You don't want to use terms that are confusing or overly long or flat, what we would call flowery language. You want to make sure that you're just very clear in what you're saying. In terms of scientific writing, you want to write well in general. So this slide and the following slides are some general grammatical errors that I've seen over the years in teaching this class that will hopefully prevent you from making the same mistakes. So one, make sure that you're using complete sentences. You want to have a noun and a verb that are expressing a complete thought within an individual sentence. A sentence is not simply a group of words. For instance, if I were to say 55 UNCC psychology students in December, that would be incorrect because there's no verb. The correct version would be 55 UNCC psychology students graduated in December. So identify the noun and verb in the correct example. So the noun is the UNCC psychology students, and the verb is graduated. Some other examples: the student felt nervous before the speech. Is that a full sentence? What do you think? Well, it is a full sentence, right? Because there's a noun, the student, the subject, and there is a verb, felt. How about thought about leaving the room? Is that a full sentence? What do you think? No, it's not a full sentence because there's no noun. You also want to make sure that you have subject-verb agreement. So, for instance, if you have one person, like Alex, you could say Alex runs, but if you have two people or more, you could say Alex and Frank run. Alex and Frank run, rather than Alex and Frank runs. Make sure that you're using your apostrophes correctly. For instance, researchers, that first one, is possessive, the researcher's pen, versus the researchers, which is a plural possessive, meaning many researchers' pen, we all share a pen, versus researchers. Researchers has, without an apostrophe, is not a possessive term, simply a plural term. You want to use correct words. So here are some common errors that I've seen. than with an A versus then with an E. For instance, X is greater than Y, not X is greater than Y. Effect versus affect. Affect with an E versus affect with an A. Affect can be used as a verb, so the policy affects students, and a noun. He displays positive affect. Affect can also be used in this way as denoting an emotional state. The word affect is usually a noun. The policy has negative effects. You want to be careful to avoid cliffhanger words without using the rest of the sentence. So these cliffhanger words include if, when, and because. Here's an example. If you come home on time, ... So then what? That's not a complete sentence. You need to make sure that you complete the thought and you explain what will happen if the person comes home on time. You want to use economy of expression. So what does that mean? It means to use as few words as possible to avoid wordiness, redundancy, what we call flowery language. I have trouble with that one. Emotional undertones, and potentially biased language. For example, it is important to note that in order to determine the results, the researcher must test the hypotheses. Seems like a reasonable sentence, right? But this one is actually better. The researcher must test the hypotheses to determine the result. So I've said the same thing, but I've used fewer words. That's good scientific writing, according to APA style. Precision is extremely important, so you want to consider the precise meaning of the words that you're using and only use words that convey exactly what you mean. This can be kind of tricky at first, but you want to read your paper out loud to yourself to catch places where you can be more precise. Oftentimes when you're writing a paper, you're so entrenched in that paper and you're so familiar with it that it can be hard for you to see where things could be maybe clearer to the reader and what maybe the language could be more precise. One way that you can help yourself get over that is to just read it out loud. That will help you. If you have someone who can also read it for you, they might be able to suggest ways where, places where they have questions about what you've written or ways that you could maybe make your language clearer and more precise. You want to avoid using what we call colloquial or informal language. So avoid things like kind of, lots of, etc. Similarly, avoid using big or complicated words. So like I said earlier, be as clear as possible and use as simple terms as possible. I think one mistake that I see students making in this class is to use very complicated words and to kind of go overboard in terms of the language that they're using. Scientific writing is not meant to use complicated words. It's meant to convey things as clearly as possible so that other people can understand what you're proposing and what you did in your study. Continuing on, do not refer to the reader as you or people collectively as us. So for instance, you wouldn't want to write in your introduction, as we all know, we meaning the reader and everyone else on the planet. You don't want to do that. Also, do not refer to proving a hypothesis. I covered this in your methods review, but you can't prove a hypothesis, remember? What do we do instead? What do you think? Well, instead, we seek evidence through our study that we can use to support a hypothesis. Our evidence may not support a hypothesis. However, we cannot prove a hypothesis. We cannot prove a theory or a hypothesis. We're just simply seeking evidence that may or may not support that theory and that hypothesis. I went over this earlier in today's lecture, so I'm not going to go over it again, but as a quick reminder, this is the overall outline of your introduction section, your opening paragraphs, your variable number 1, variable number 2, variable number 3, and then your paragraphs to tie together your variables. Now I'm going to transition to again talk about that first paragraph or those first few paragraphs in your paper, because I mentioned in our last video that this is something that can be quite difficult, and it's oftentimes something that you do after you have written the rest of your outline. Okay, so the opening paragraphs provide a reader with the roadmap for your entire introduction. Number one, you want to provide a general statement about your research question in your opening paragraph or paragraphs. Number two, you want to provide a statement of why this research is important with rationale. So in other words, why should we care about this research question? Let's talk about a few ways in which a study might be considered important. First, from a theoretical standpoint, so do we need to test a theory or advance a theory or change a theory in some way? In terms of its contribution to the research literature, so is it new to the literature? Is it novel, which basically means new in some way? If it has been studied before, make the case for why we should study it again. So oftentimes this has to do with limitations of prior studies, maybe in terms of the external validity of those studies or the internal validity of those studies. Do you remember what those terms mean? So external validity has to do with the generalizability of your study to other samples and populations, and the internal validity of your study has to do with how confident you can be that the findings that you got are due to the manipulations or the predictor variables in your study. If it has been studied before, if it has not been studied before, then you also need to make the case of why it should be studied. So what is it about this topic that you think is important? Is it generally important to society? So is it a topic that is important to know about to help people's lives become better in some way? In terms of practical knowledge, so is it a study where the results might have implications for the way that people do things or organizations do things like schools or hospitals or workplaces? Number three, an explanation of why you are proposing your specific hypotheses in the way that you are. So how are you making that case? Provide a brief overview and definitions of your key constructs here if they're not obvious. Number four, provide a general statement overall of your study hypotheses in sentence form. Again, we went over this last time, but this is just a review to help you springboard into writing your opening paragraphs. In the red on top, number 1 and 2, these are the research question and why it's important. The green text below that is an example of an additional statement of importance in making the case for the hypotheses, along with definitions of the key constructs. The purple text near the bottom is making the case continued and the statement of my hypotheses in sentence form. I'll conclude just by saying that first drafts of your introduction always suck. Now, I don't mean that to be rude, but even my own writing is never good the first time. You got to get something down on paper, so you got to start somewhere. Don't be afraid to just start typing. The best way to write a paper is to write something. And if you've been doing the assignments in sequence for this class, then you should have an outline to start with. So take that outline and use the tips from this lecture to just start writing. Flesh it out, keep referring to your course readings, the videos here, and your course slides as much as you need to, and certainly reach out for assistance. Don't forget to leave time for yourself to proofread, revise, and proofread again, because a lot of the work when you're writing a paper comes from your revisions.